Well, welcome everyone to the first of a series of webinars hosted by Juro. I'm Richard Mabey, co-founder here at Juro, and this webinar will be on a subject particularly close to our hearts, which is legal design. And we're going to be covering the GDPR challenge that no one is talking about. With me, I'm particularly excited to be hosting Marie Potel-Saville. Hi, Marie.
Hi, Richard. Very pleased to be here.
A couple of reasons for that. First, we've worked together with Marie as actually a client of Juro's when she was with Estee Lauder. And now we've kind of in parallel developed this interest in legal design, and she has gone on to be a full-time professional legal designer as the founder and CEO of Dot's Paris office.
That's right. I'm actually on a rehab, I suppose. I used to be a private practice lawyer and then former GC at Estee Lauder companies, and I'm now founder and CEO of the Paris office of Dot.
Great. So this webinar will be recorded and the slides will be circulated afterwards. We'd love, as we go, for you to submit any questions, which you can do directly through the Zoom system. And at the end, we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. So what will we cover in this webinar? The first thing is just very concretely, what is legal design? And almost more important than that, why does it matter? Why is it important, and why should you, as in-house lawyers, academics, practitioners, be concerned about it? We're also going to cover why it's especially relevant today, and we're going to look at the regulatory imperative around GDPR and explain why we think that today, more than ever, legal design has a place for the in-house lawyer. Even better than that, we're going to be looking very practically at what we did at Juro recently with a case study on our own privacy policy, which we redesigned using a design sprint framework internally. And then we'll move on, and Marie will take us through, well, what would that look like for an in-house lawyer? So fine, Juro is a startup focused on legal design, but we've got some constraints. What ultimately can we do internally to deliver value for our internal client? And we'll also get on to, very practically again, a toolkit. So what can you take away from this webinar that will inspire you to go and run your own design sprints internally, and what can you actually use to make that happen? We'll try and reserve around 10 minutes at the end for questions, and do stay on the line for that. So first, I'll hand over to Marie and we'll cover what is legal design.
Thank you, Richard. Legal design is a fairly new approach, and there is no single definition of legal design, but we thought it could be useful to talk you through what leaders in legal design are saying about this new approach. So first, of course, we have to start with Margaret Hagan, almost the inventor of legal design, I should say. She's the director of the Legal Design Lab at Stanford, as most of you would already know, and on top of being an incredibly generous and brilliant professional, what she says about legal design is that it's mostly an innovation approach, which means focusing on the humans within the legal system to understand what the crucial breakdowns in the system right now exist, and to make the creative leap to define what a better system might be. So this is actually a radical shift in paradigm. Instead of starting with the law, you actually start with the users. How amazing. Then, of course, Stefania Passera also has very interesting and brilliant views about legal design, and Richard will talk you through her work in a minute, because she's the author, I would say, or the co-author of Juro's privacy policy. And basically what she says is that legal design borrows design thinking and doing. Doing is really key here. It requires user research, lateral and visual thinking, ideation, prototyping, and testing. It draws heavily on information, service, and interaction design skills to rethink the complexity of legal processes, services, and documents, says Stefania. And then we also thought that it would be really interesting to tell you what Emma Jelly has to say about legal design. Emma spent about 10 years as in-house counsel at Google, and she then moved on to being a GC at Onfido. And for her, it's a collaborative, multidisciplinary approach, and it's basically about lawyers not flying solo. So what she says is that for a lawyer to embrace legal design is to adopt this collaborative, multidisciplinary approach to communicating legal concepts. And early on, the legal design process requires the identification of project-specific stakeholders and specialists. And these individuals could include social psychologists, designers, technologists, users, of course, and regulators. And then, of course, I cannot but mentioning Antti
Another
Inanen.
Finnish person in this list, so we're 3 out of 4.
And it's no coincidence, because obviously Finland is one of the home countries of design, the home country of Alvar Aalto, and they have this amazing design and design thinking culture, which I think is the reason why they're slightly more advanced than some of us in that field.
France is catching up.
Hopefully. So Antti Inanen is now one of my partners. He's the founder, one of the co-founders of DOT in Helsinki. He's also one of the co-founders of the Legal Design Summit, also in Helsinki. And to him, legal design revolutionizes the practice of law by putting the user at the center of the action. So again, instead of starting from the law and trying to be educational for human beings, basically, with legal designers start with the user, and not just users in general, but an actual persona. And we try to define the user's constraints, environment, what he or she really wants and needs. So what all these definitions have in common is the following. Of course, legal design is basically the application of design thinking to the field of law. It also borrows UX to UX design in a way. But the key, and what we really want to stress, is the user-centric approach. And we thought it would be interesting for you to see what Stefania Passera illustrated very well, is that in a way it simply doesn't make sense that all the contracts that we've all been working on as whether private practice or in-house lawyers, they all look and feel the same, those agreements. Incidentally, they're drafted in terms of language and concepts like, I don't know, 50 years ago, even though those agreements are addressed to different users and are supposed to be implemented by different business people. So it really doesn't make sense that one size should fit all, and actually it doesn't work, as we often see. So also, of course, one of the common features is ideation, prototyping and testing. And here, maybe what's a bit unusual for lawyers is this idea of possibly failing fast. We hate failure, don't we?
For good reasons.
Exactly, we're lawyers. We're kind of risk adverse. And this idea basically is absolutely not to make any concessions on quality, absolutely not. The idea is to prototype early, to test the first idea, and then adjust rapidly. So it doesn't mean that we don't end up with an absolutely top-notch product or process. It's just that as a first step, we just have to try it and then refine the approach. And of course, it's not just about lawyers. So it's about lawyers collaborating with other professionals, designers, users. And that's fairly new as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's sometimes funny that legal design, people tend to recognize it when they see it. And so I think this nice image from Stefania here is kind of very, very clear in that respect.
Exactly. Now, moving on to why legal design is really important now, today, probably more than ever. And here, I guess that many in-house lawyers will agree with the fact that this need to do ever more with less is plaguing most corporations. So it will probably resonate with a number of you. And what does that mean in practice? Just to give you an example, I was hired to set up the legal division of Estée Lauder companies in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, with this amazing team of 5 people, including myself.
I remember being a bit shocked by that when we started working together.
So, of course, all of them are absolutely brilliant and very hardworking, but even so, I mean, what can you do for 28 brands and 17 affiliates? Well, it simply means that you have to resort to tools to be more efficient, to handle work in a faster way. And also to be sure that the legal advice that you're providing in-house is actually implementing, because you simply do not have the time or the budget to double check, and it could be a risk situation if what you advise is not followed internally. So I think this is here. This is where legal design is really useful, because the mere fact that you co-create the solutions with the users simply implies that implementation is effortless and very, very fluid. And there's also this idea that most corporations are actually undergoing a drastic transformation simply because of the world we're living, which means that you always have to be agile and collaborative. You know, this idea of the expert lawyer sitting in in his or her office just by himself, no matter how brilliant he is, it's over. I mean, that's absolutely no longer the way that you can work nowadays. But mostly what we discussed with Richard, and we couldn't agree more on this, is that there's now something absolutely ridiculous online, which is, that most people tick the box saying, I agree to either terms and conditions or privacy policy. We'll come to it in a minute, which is probably the greatest lie ever. Because even as lawyers, we don't read the policies or the T&Cs, and yet we click just because all we want is to buy this product or scroll on this website, and that's it. But in a way, we'll see that this has to end, because there's such an imbalance of powers.
And I think that this image here is, I'm right in thinking that that's the terms and conditions actually written out of various major tech companies end to end. Is that right?
Exactly, Richard. And this image, we thought you all had to see it. So it's a designer. She's called Dima Yarovinsky, and she simply took the actual privacy policies of those major tech companies and printed them on the same format, so same font, same A4 paper sheets, just different colors. And I think it illustrates really well this lie that, of course, no one agrees simply because no one read those terms.
I still want to know who's the purple one on the right, the worst of them, but unfortunately can't for legal reasons.
Exactly. We're not going to drop names here, but you could double check for yourselves if you wanted to. Okay. So now moving on to I think a shift. To be honest, when I started implementing legal design in-house as a GC, I thought at first that legal design was something which was nice to have, which would improve the efficiency, ease the implementation of legal advice. But then I realized that there are a number of areas of law where this is no longer nice to have, but really a must have. And this is particularly striking in the area of privacy, simply because GDPR is trying to shift, this imbalance of powers between those large corporations imposing those terms that no one reads, and the fact that to be able, that for the consent of the users, to be informed? Well, they have to read. Otherwise, how could they be informed? So we thought that those quotes actually from, just a bit of law once in a while doesn't hurt. So Richard, maybe you want to give say a word on Article 12.
I was pretty surprised when I saw this. I mean, we're a data controller, so we needed to go through an exercise. And I just read this a couple of times. And the first time I read it, privacy notices must be concise, transparent, intelligible, and easily accessible. The first thing I thought was, wow, I mean, that would be great. I'd love that as a consumer. And I thought, as a lawyer, well, maybe I don't solve this problem. Maybe I make that worse, not better. So we've got this regulatory mandate in the regulation. And interesting now to see some of these guidelines coming out to clarify what does that actually mean.
Exactly. And the Working Party 29, so the group of regulators in terms of data privacy, actually issued guidelines on informed consent for the purposes of GDPR, as you probably know. And very interestingly, I think it's Article 332 that says that controllers cannot use long privacy policies that are difficult to understand or statements full of legal jargon. And here maybe I could share my reaction, still as a GC, when I read that. And then I went on to check the privacy policy, which was provided to us by a brilliant law firm, very reputable. And technically, this document was perfect. But then it really got me thinking, okay, is it a long document? Well, I'm afraid it is. Is it difficult to understand? Well, yes. And is it full of legal jargon? I'm afraid so as well. So, I think there's a real shift here. And basically, European law increasingly imposes higher standards of clarity and accessibility of legal information, not just in terms of privacy, but obviously consumer protection and a number of other areas. So I think this is actually, that there is an actual need for legal design, including being encouraged by regulators. And it gives us actually a nice transition to what the French data privacy has announced a couple of weeks ago. They announced their priorities for 2018. And very interestingly, design is part of their priorities, precisely to tackle this problem that legal information is simply not accessible enough.
Yet another reason to move to France.
Possibly. We welcome everyone.
Brilliant. So I think we'll transition on to the case study at this point. Just to give a little bit of context, so at Juro, we are a data controller, and so we went through the exercise that many of you will have gone through with your own businesses in mapping where personal data is being connected to in various systems. And one part of that was we realized we needed to update our privacy policy. So we've been banging on about legal design for quite a while here at Juro, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to put our money where our mouth is and actually try and deliver on the promise of GDPR, a privacy policy that you wouldn't need a law degree to read, firstly, and secondly, one that wasn't simply written by lawyers for lawyers. So what you can see on screen is actually the summary modal. So when you click privacy on our website at juro.com, this is what you see, and then you can click through to the full policy, which we'll see in a minute.
Can I just say, Richard, that I absolutely love it, and big kudos to Stefania Pesera for designing it. It's probably one of the best examples I've seen. So this is really, I think, something totally new and so easy to understand, and yet totally legally robust. We'll come to it in a minute.
We had a lot of fun doing this with Stefania. And bizarrely, the privacy is now our second most read page at Juro on our website, which
this is
before
brilliant.
I think we're getting 3 hits a day, and now I think it's in suddenly the hundreds or maybe thousands. So let's jump into how we did this. So we took the classic design sprint process, which started with defining what the problem was we want to solve. So we're in the business of selling solutions. And often solutions don't really get you where you need to be unless you've really defined the problem well. So as we saw it, the problem was actually made pretty clear by GDPR. Long documents full of jargon, no one reads them, no one can understand them, and ultimately there's no value exchange delivered. The next phase was to set up the team. So as Marie said, this isn't just about lawyers. And so we actually had a team which covered Stefania as our legal information designer, me leading that team as CEO of a business because we thought it needed great buy-in. Alice, our marketing manager, who's actually with us here today, Tom, who's our content editor, and then Anton, who's our front-end developer. So actually a 5-person team working just on a privacy policy and replacing that classic process, which is legal creates a policy, sends it over to engineering, it gets implemented. So big step next was ideation. And that was simply just playing around with some ideas. So again, taking my lawyer hat on and putting my creative design hat on and just trying a few things out. And really one of the main parts of that was choosing the design patterns we're going to use. And so we actually drew really heavily on a couple of brilliant designers, Margaret Hagan and Helena Hapio, have published some great open source design patterns which really influenced us in that regard. And essentially the process was actually relatively simple. We chose a pattern, we mocked something up quickly, and then we tested it on users. And that testing process at that very early stage, not testing a polished product, but just trying some things out, gave us what that little thin line is, which is a feedback loop. And so that feedback loop went multiple times as we iterated, just with sometimes hand-drawn sketches, sometimes low-fidelity prototypes. And I think actually Marie was one of the.
I was about to say, am I allowed to say this?
Yeah.
As a client of Juro's, as at Estée Lauder, I was lucky actually to be part of the focus group. And I was very happy to provide feedback, and I think it even got better after this iteration process. So that's very interesting as well to see like the stage that we're at during the focus group and then the end result.
Yes, and I think we had in that group people from all different kinds of backgrounds. So some with great legal knowledge, but actually some with no legal knowledge and awareness. And we ran those sessions in a very structured way, which Stefania was great at running as a designer. From there, the next process was just iterations. So, we refined, we've produced a new version, we got more feedback, and then ultimately we released it. We released it a few weeks ago. And actually, as part of that release, there's a line in the policy saying, if you have any feedback on the way this has been designed, please email us or hit the intercom button on our website. And people have. And that's the great thing, which is that this process is actually still ongoing in that final feedback loop. So we're going to go through just a couple of the key problems we went to. The first one was essentially what we thought of as the privacy fire hydrant. So what we meant by this is giving a privacy policy to your customers, and often these are customer-facing documents, they don't have to be, but they often are, is a little bit like offering them a drink and then directing them to this fire hydrant of information. And it just wasn't really going to do. So we essentially went through this process of iterations, which culminated in an approach which we called layering. So if you look at the original policy here, this was layer number 1. So this was the summary modal. And then when you click through, you had this whole policy, which itself was layered. So you can see the read more, read less buttons, which would give drop downs, so you can see these little tags around the legal basis, which would link to other parts of the documents. And essentially you can see the transition from that early stage on the left, which are actually real sketches from Stefania, which we were sharing, I remember, over Google Hangouts and trying to work out what we were going to do, and where ultimately the finished product went. So it's kind of an easy approach is just to strike lots of things out of your policy and translate the language into plainer English. But actually for us, we tried to go beyond that. So it wasn't just about making things simpler, it was about preserving legal meaning and also making it communicable. And that's actually a lot harder. But it is
a lot harder, but I think this is what true legal design is about, in my opinion.
I think that's right. And I think, sometimes people will talk about this, like, is legal design about applying lipstick? I've heard this phrase used, and it's just absolutely not that. This is really deep information design. Actually making it look nice didn't really take the time. What really took the time was thinking about how that information should be layered. And interestingly, the GDPR, if you get to recital 60, and well done if you do, we got that far. It actually talks about the use of icons and layering as a useful way of communicating that information. So just to remind everyone, you can ask questions at any point during the webinar, and they'll be collected and we'll jump in at the end. So if you have any questions, do ask them in real time, and we'll move on to the second problem we looked at. So aside from just the first problem, which was sheer quantity of information, when you actually look at the information, the other problem we identified was people generally don't understand what it means, unless you're a lawyer.
That's pretty obvious.
and so as I mentioned, trying to preserve that legal meaning and make it readable is really hard. And one of the things which actually the GDPR encourages, and certainly we as legal designers think is useful, is just use of icons. And you see this everywhere throughout landing pages and on the internet. So it's really not that hard to find icons. There are plenty of open source sets out here. These actually weren't custom built. This is an open source set that we used. The hard thing is working out, well, like, why do you have these icons? Are you just sticking in an icon for the sake of it? Or is it going to mean that if someone looks at this document at a glance, they're going to get more meaning and faster? And so the only way we could really work it out was to ask people. So maybe Marie will actually remember from one of the stages in the feedback process was we just showed people a bunch of icons. And so you can see here in this case that who we are section of the summary, we showed people 3 icons, and then whose data collect, we showed people 2 icons. And actually, if you look back here at the privacy policy, we actually used for when and how we collect data a completely different icon. So again, iterating, going backwards and forwards, and if we had any feedback we could learn from, we did. So moving on to the third problem, this was essentially a little bit more of a kind of micro problem in privacy. So we're going to kind of really drill down past the layering and the icons and the top level things. The first and foremost piece of feedback we got when we asked users was, I'm concerned when you are collecting my data and what you're doing with it. And so if you look in the standard privacy policies, there's usually a kind of section or a paragraph saying data collected automatically, or data that you give us. And then there's a pile of text. And we spent a long time looking at these, sort of staring at these pages and thinking, I'm still a bit confused. You know, I remember looking at some sort of tech giants, privacy policies, just thinking, I just want to know, as a user, I know what I do with your tool. I go on your website, and I log in, and I do this and that. What's actually happening? And so we just completely rearranged that as a timeline. And so we thought of this as a privacy journey. And it really starts with the moment you get to our website, and it ends with the moment you leave our service. We hope you don't, but ultimately throughout there are multiple touch points, and sometimes it's automatic, as indicated by our little robot friend, and sometimes it's the customer that gives it to us.
I think that this ties in very nicely with the approach that we're trying to define earlier on. You know, this user journey, which is totally part of the approach and process when you're legally designing a document. So this is what you come up with after having defined the user journey. So this is, I think, extremely powerful, because this is among the clearest examples I've seen. And that's exactly what this methodology of user journey achieves. Absolutely.
And the kind of the question we had when we finished the results, when we finished the project was, you know, what results would we see as a business? You know, we spent a lot of time kind of working on this. We've had multiple stakeholders. We had our external counsel involved as well. And make no mistake, this is tough work to do well. It's not something that will happen overnight, and it will need significant resource. But we saw some pretty surprising results. The first was this 1,352% increase in unique views. And that's, by the way, not of just the pop-up summary, but that's the whole policy. So that we actually have hundreds, if not thousands of people clicking onto our privacy policy, which if the GDPR is to be given credence, that's one of the objectives, is to kind of get better awareness. So that's been great. We've also had better engagement from our stakeholders. So often now we'll be asked to sign data protection agreements, as many of us will be. It's pretty nice also to be able to say, you know, and by the way, have a look at our privacy policy where you can see, you know, for example, the third parties with whom we share your data. And it just, I think from a brand perspective, and I think Marie will come on to this a little bit when we talk about what this actually looks like in-house, it's really important for us to have a brand that is transparent with our customers, and I think it comes full circle in that transparency. And finally, we can't forget the risk of the 4% annual turnover fine. Slightly painful for
everybody's
us,
mind.
Probably more painful for Estée Lauder than us, but we're almost at that level. And finally, I think the kind of surprising result we didn't quite expect was we just saw a real shift in team mindset. And just within our team at Juro, I think this is the kind of exercise people love getting involved in. It's very positive. It really gets people thinking about users, and it gets people to a position with something as boring, frankly, as a legal document. I say this as a former lawyer, to something that people are going to love. And I think that for us has been a really great experience. It kind of brings us on to the question of, okay, well, Juro can do that, but what about if you're a large multinational organization and you've got constraints? And there's no better person, I think, to talk through that than Marie.
Yeah, at this point, you're probably wondering how to put this into practice in real life, in-house context, in large organizations. So here I can probably share my experience at Estée Lauder. Let's face it, there are a number of constraints. We're not going to lie about this. The first constraint I was faced with was that none of my business people, none of my internal clients had time for this. The key phrase at Estée Lauder is, back-to-back meetings, like a whole week long.
Not just Estée Lauder.
Not just Estée Lauder, presumably.
Yeah.
And apart from giving them a couple of pieces of advice, maybe in terms of getting slightly better organized and say no to a number of meetings, this really has to be taken into account. So it's also about how you convince people to get to a workshop with you, and it's about time, but it's also about the perception that your internal clients, they basically couldn't care less about law. They have a day job, and basically they want you to sort legal stuff, as they say, out, and they almost don't care how you do it. They just want the end result, and that's that. So it takes persistence. It takes also communication skills to take them fully on board. What's encouraging is that once you've overcome this first constraint as to time, and if you manage to organize the first workshop, then the feedback is really great, and we'll come to that in a moment. The other constraint could be the budget, although I have to say it's probably not the main hurdle I've seen internally. I think it's mostly about mindset more than about money. It's about getting people working together and breaking up habits, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that expensive.
And the cost in-house is going to be mostly people time.
Exactly, it's people time, not necessarily.
And plus post-it notes and
that
kind of thing, right?
That's manageable.
It's manageable,
usually.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the strategic buy-in is key, and here my advice is going to be very basic, but still usually efficient. Get yourself an internal sponsor. That's really how it works. Find someone who's convinced that this is the right approach, and have him do the job for you and with you. There, I have to say, I was really lucky, because the president of the region in EMEA I was reporting to was also on a very deeply transformational journey for the company. So it was all about testing and learning and doing things differently. So he couldn't actually be happier that legal would also jump into that new trend. So I got a lot of encouragement, but I'm sure each of you can find a sponsor, and that's really important. And then, internally within your legal team, you'll probably have people who would say, oh, this is awesome, I want to do this, this is new, this looks a lot of work, but also a lot of fun. And then you'll also have people, and that's very understandable, saying, look, I've got a day job already, and it's you increasing my workload, and as a manager you should know that. So how am I supposed to handle all this? And here, what I can share with you is that I was absolutely amazed and deeply happy to see the results in my very young and very small team, which is probably easier, but really after having implemented a number of small legal design projects, for example, we had this privacy awareness motion video that we did just for the region as a first step. And then actually it got some further buy-in from the headquarters, interestingly, and it became a worldwide project. So still a 2-minute video, nothing huge, but it was released globally by the headquarters on the internal privacy day, so that was interesting. And really what it did to my young small team was great, because I think it really helped us build this trust. And I think it's due to the fact that it's a completely different way of managing your team. You know, it's one thing to, let's say, be a nice boss, like, you know, you talk to people nicely and you give them feedback and you encourage them, which is fairly basic. But then if you co-create with the members of your team, which we did for this video, we co-created the script and the scenario, and then it really creates this lasting and deep trust that I hadn't experienced before. So that's.
And did you find as well that there's a kind of getting that connection to your internal client, you get a little bit closer to the business?
Absolutely. I was going to mention that as well. What I could observe was really a shift in mindset, so that my internal clients would look at me differently, literally. I think this collaborative approach with the users, this co-creation with the users, really changes their perception, and you stop being only a spoiled spot. You're still a bit of a spoiled spot, of course. We're lawyers, but not just that. And you also become, facilitators and innovators. And I think it's not just about lawyers, trying to be followers in terms of innovation. We can actually drive innovation. So we've already talked about the enhanced trust within the legal team. I think one of the other learnings that's important to share is, to let go on perfection at an early stage. And again, this is absolutely not me saying that we should in any way compromise on quality. Absolutely not. I think that we are all obsessed with quality and we want top-notch end results. There's no question about that. It's just that at a first stage, it's okay to test a first prototype that is just a prototype. So it doesn't even have to be judged as, whether or not it's perfect. It's just irrelevant because it's a prototype and it's okay to be so.
It's kind of interesting when you get all the way to the end of the design process. Suddenly you have to kind of shift the mindset again to this very detail-orientated kind of looking for perfection in the document. Actually, lawyers in some ways are great at that, right? Because we're great at picking holes in things. We're great at kind of, polishing and perfecting documents. And so I think it's probably a little bit painful for Stefania for me to endlessly blast her with this feedback. But it's, as Marie says, at that early stage, just taking a step back and trying some things out.
And the other learning I want to share is really the increase in legal safety. Just because if you co-create, if you include your business people, your users into the process, then the implementation of your advice is going to be effortless. And that's a huge shift, actually, from business people merely sitting on your advice, if I may say so, which happens sometimes, more often than not, and just them fully understanding, fully grasping what this is about, and actually implementing it. And for example, I legally designed the compliance program, part of the compliance program in competition law, and the feedback I got was quite surprising, honestly. I had people knocking on my door saying, I want more training. Can you please extend the training that you've just done to another team? I want more. And the questions they asked clearly showed that they were actually implementing at least part of what I had suggested. So again, very, very encouraging. So I also wanted to share with you the fact that it's not just about privacy policies. Of course, legal design has broad implementation potential, in our opinion. Maybe what could be interesting is just briefly touching upon the first project that I did internally, which was actually to use legal design in a process, not in a document. Basically, I was faced with a need to automate the terms and conditions of all the brands at ELC in all those countries. But I didn't want to embark in these, what I call the monster projects. Some of you might be familiar with, the projects which take forever to complete. And by the time you complete them, basically the needs have changed. So you need to do everything all over again. So I used legal design to ensure that the automation tool that we would end up with would actually fit the needs of all my brands at the time and in all these countries and the people using it. And incidentally, we ended up choosing Juro, but that's a different topic. Anyway, I think that the real value of legal design here was precisely, the lean approach and the fact that this test and learn process enabled us to wrap it up in 4 months, more or less, which I think is quite very, very reasonable in terms of duration.
Yes.
Then I went on using legal design in compliance program, and then what I want to say here is really I think that one of the key differences using legal design in terms of compliance is that you actually have this power of implementation that you get thanks to the fact that you defined the user journey that we talked about previously. So when your internal clients start talking about, say, resale price maintenance, and they know they should do it, etc. But when do they start talking about resale prices with their counterparts? When does it end? How does it work? What's the process? What are the constraints? What are the key moments? And this definition of the user journey actually enables you to insert the legal principles in a very fluid way into that user journey, which leads to effortless implementation. So I think that's quite powerful. And obviously, legal design is also about designing engaging documents. So basically documents that business people would want to read and therefore implement. And that's obviously very helpful when your key message is basically about everything the business should not do. And then there's just a very small snapshot here about, again, a privacy policy, but it's not the only document that could benefit from legal design. A small before, after. I think we don't have to explain much further, do we?
It's interesting. I mean, I read both documents. I had a better time reading the second one. And I guess, again, nice to see that sort of brand compliance. You really kind of get in this case, this is Estee Lauder company, so you get the sort of elegance coming straight out of that document, which I think is really, really nice.
So this is still work in progress, by the way, not a final document. But you see, this is a prototype. That's actually a good example. Yeah. And yet we can talk about it and show it.
Great. So in terms of the kind of tools that people can use, what would you say, Marie?
I think the obvious source is the amazing site designed by Margaret Hagen. She's really incredibly generous, and she's sharing on a very regular basis amazing examples, but also very practical tools and tips about how to do it by yourself. So I can only encourage you to have a look at the first link that we're mentioning here, which is the Legal Design Lab by Margaret. This is hugely insightful and also so nice to watch, I have to say.
And it's quite broad in approach, isn't it? Because some of it is about how would you rethink the experience of a litigant in person at court, for example, or the process of paying a parking ticket, not just in the kind of corporate and commercial context.
Absolutely. She's heavily into law for good, and I think she sees legal design as a very powerful vector of access to justice, which resonates a lot with me as well. well. So it's much broader, as you said.
And Lexpert is Helena Hapio and Stefania Passera. That was really how kind of one of the ways we became really interested in the topic. There's some great resources there on their site, and then of course DOS and this and the legal design canvas is one of my absolute favorites.
Yeah, so we wanted to share with everyone this legal design canvas, which is freely available on our website. And this is absolutely not meant to be any sort of authority. It's just a proposal. It's just some kind of help to get you guys going if you want to, because legal design is really about doing. I think that's the key message. You can see many people talking about it, but the key is just to start doing it, and that could be the first start. So
can you get that on the dot website?
Yes, yeah. Yes, you can download it for free. We're not demanding your personal data to download it.
Got it. And then from the Juro side, we our blog is called Legal Design in Practice, so we have insights there at blog.juro.com. And then from an events perspective, we've actually got a couple of good examples here. One is probably the most long-standing event, which is the Legal Design Summit.
Yeah, which is going to be actually this year not organized by DOT, which did an amazing job these past 2 years, but they feel that it's important to empower younger lawyers as well, and they're going to hand it over to students in Helsinki who are going to organize it this year. And they did already a brilliant job helping out last year. So
and it's a great excuse to go to Finland.
It is. Definitely. There's also a LinkedIn group for it's called in-house legal design. So the idea here is just to help each other, because we know that it could be hard to start with. We could be faced with a number of constraints, and I say we because I set it up when I was in-house, and I still have this this idea of all the constraints. So it's just a free space to share ideas, constraints, and get some help, and just get to know nice people as well.
And in terms of the university design jams, that's something that I think you've been to that before.
I didn't attend it, unfortunately, but I thought that it looked really worth it, interesting.
And these design jams are, generally speaking, very open sessions where you can go in, you can try some stuff out, you can jump in on a project, you can bring your team. A great way to just start doing rather than hearing us talk.
Absolutely. I can only encourage you to go into any legal design jam. As to me, I attended and participated to the Brain Factory, which was just before the Legal Design Summit in Helsinki last year. So it was a very full weekend, like from Friday evening to Sunday evening, and you just work in groups from 9 to 10 in the evening. On a very specific topic, and then at the end of the weekend you have to build a prototype and pitch in 3 minutes. It's
kind of the design version of a hackathon.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And you learn so much in this very short time frame. I can only encourage you to do so.
And the final thing we'd mention is, so Legal Geek is actually running a new event now called Legal Design Geek, and that's going to be the day after the Legal Geek conference in October. So for full transparency, Juro is sponsoring that event with nothing to do really with the organization of it. But it's interesting to note a couple of things. I think one is that there's buy-in from the community for it to have a 500-person event, which is kind of shocking to me in a way, because I think a couple of years ago, when Marie and I first got interested in this topic, it was really a handful of people in the world who had an interest in it. So that's going to be in October. Do come along to it. I think it's a good chance to hear from people who've done legal design projects in practice.
And I think there will also be a legal design panel at Legal Geek conference just the day before.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah.
So it's definitely a good sign in any event that Legal Geek is all over, yeah.
I think they've got 4,000 people coming to their main conference.
Amazing.
Okay.
That's twice as much as last year.
It's twice as much as last year, I think, and twice as much the year before. So we've got about 10 minutes left. Hopefully this has been useful. We've covered both what is legal design, why is it important. We've covered Why is it especially important today with the regulatory mandate coming from GDPR? We've covered real-life case studies, both from the Juro perspective with this privacy policy in the case of it essentially going viral, but also from the in-house perspective, and how you can actually get this done. And finally, we provided a toolkit which we hope will prove useful as you do your own design work in-house. In terms of questions, as I say, the webinar will be recorded and a link will be sent out later along with the slides. We've got lots of questions coming in. So we'll start with the first question, which is, can you give some links, examples of redesigned privacy policies now live? So it's interesting that, there aren't that many good examples. I think probably the one I would point you to is Google. So Google actually updated their privacy policy. Probably everyone on this webinar, if you've got a Gmail email address, will have got a notification there. I think they've done quite a good job. There's, I think, videos involved in it, and they've kind of really cleaned up the language. I think another kind of quite interesting, actually quite funny example is EasyJet. EasyJet has a privacy policy that is a video in the style of a safety briefing from their air hosts and air hostesses.
That's a good one.
So it's definitely worth taking a look at that. But I would stress that I'm quite shocked that we're so close now to GDPR. And
few examples, to be honest.
Yeah. I think another one actually is Typeform is worth looking at. So Typeform actually sort of have a legal version and a plain English version. Again, we took a slightly different approach, but worth maybe having a look at that as well.
Yeah, and I know that my partners at Dot in Helsinki are involved in a number of privacy projects, which are going to be live in a couple of weeks. So we'll share those examples as well, obviously.
Okay, so the next question is, let's not get too fixated on privacy policies. So could this legal design, clean and visual approach be applied to commercial contracts, B2C or even B2B?
Absolutely. I can even share with you that I'm actually still working for Estée Lauder as a provider. And actually one of their brands is has a problem with their influencer agreements, basically because the influencers simply don't read them, don't sign the agreements, which leads to all sorts of risks and issues, obviously. And so that's B2B in a way, because influencers, even though they make a living out of it, so it's still B2B. And so it's just one example, but we've got plenty of other B2B examples. It could be also complex commercial contracts in a number of areas. It could be also not necessarily agreements, but also complex legal processes. We are currently working for the Finnish International Arbitration Chamber to entirely redesign the way the arbitration process is explained. So that's also an example.
I think it's broad applications generally that legal design can help with. I think from our own experience at Juro, so where we sign contracts with people, especially the more simple contracts, they are legally designed agreements, so NDAs, employment contracts, and I guess another quite practical example, things like sort of quasi-legal documents like offer letters, for example. So when we try and hire someone at Juro, we make sure that that's the best possible touch point with them. So it's plain language, it's visuals. I think it's got quite a lot of emojis on it, actually, that one. But there are examples, and as Marie says, it should be a wide application here. I think the privacy policy is just one example.
Just one example because of the news, obviously. I would also quote or mention the compliance programs. To me, from an in-house perspective, this is absolutely key, and there's very broad application in terms of compliance.
So moving on to the next question, would you approach a rework of an existing privacy policy, or could be another document, in a very small team without in-house lawyers, where the external ones are pretty classic, like that, without experience with an agile approach? So what do you think, Marie?
Well, in any event, you need people willing to do this. I mean, that's for sure. You can't just decide that you're going to legal design just by yourself, because, as we said, it's a collaborative approach. So it's lawyers working with designers, working with clients, basically. You need at least this minimal amount of people willing to do it. I think that maybe I can share this with you. I was just yesterday at Genders Dean conference. I was a speaker among a brilliant number of other speakers, and the audience was mostly what we call big law, right? And the feedback, the very positive feedback we got from law firms is actually striking. So I think, even if you say in your question that your law firm is probably pretty classic, they might be interested in this new approach. And we're actually, to be honest, getting requests from very big law firms that are interested in the approach.
And sometimes I think it gets driven by their clients, right? So it's always easier if you have a client who gives you the mandate to the law firm, rather than it just being slightly abstracted.
It's driven by their clients, but also by their millennial lawyers who no longer want to work without a meaning, without a sense of purpose, and they find precisely a sense of purpose in this collaborative approach that really benefits everyone.
And I suppose it's that thing, that collaborative approach. So I think maybe one pitfall here is you ask external counsel to draft the terms, you get horrible clunky legal document, and then you try and design it. That's going to be harder than get counsel involved right in the early stage. And I think you have to be very clear in terms of the context and the brief of what you want.
Yes, you have to define the rules right from the outset, and everybody has to agree on how you're going to do it, how possibly the legal designers are going to interact with the external counsel. But we see a lot of interest right now from very big law firms.
Okay, so on to the next question. So what if a client asks you to redesign his privacy policy? Could be any document similarly to Juro's, but no one has time or people spare to set up a team or participate in the ideation. Would it still be possible to work on the project? So I'd kind of break that down to, well, is it possible to do this essentially on your own, so as a kind of one-person band? I think it's possible, but certainly very hard, because you would need a very wide range of skills to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one, because for us, legal design is essentially this collaborative approach. So on your own, it doesn't make much sense. At the very least, you need to include your users. I mean, there is no legal design without the users. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be very time consuming. If you have no time, maybe you could just set up one workshop, and it could be like a 2-hour session. And that's that as a starting point. But then I think you really cannot do it without the users.
So you've got to get the buy-in as well, I guess, from the business. So that sounds hard. I mean, we have had a lot of people write to us to say, can we copy your privacy policy? And we always say, well, feel free to take some inspiration from it, but ultimately be very surprised if our privacy policy fitted your needs. I mean, given how specific this stuff is. So the kind of quick fix is probably not there if you want to do it really well.
Yeah, on the other hand, we were actually thinking with Dot about whether it would be worth putting together a legally designed basic policy, whatever that means. And it's a discussion that's ongoing, so I'm not promising anything, but precisely to address this need for something that's never going to be, like the right thing in terms of the full legal design approach, but maybe a first step.
Yes.
We're still discussing. We're not sure.
We'll have to have a conversation. Maybe we can do something together. But there's definitely some things you can do, but I think absolutely critical to get buy-in wherever you can. Okay, so in terms of any final questions, so what about the implications on legal safety? Let's take this very quickly in the last couple of minutes.
Very quickly in 2 minutes. From what I've seen, really, from what I've experienced, legal design is actually increasing legal safety for a very basic reason, which is that if you just stick to the same old templates, it seems to be the safe approach, because you just it's just the status quo, so you think that you're safe. It's actually the opposite. First, because your old template, if it's anything like what I've seen, it's just never implemented. And you have to just admit it. I mean, if that's the case. So in terms of legal risk, there's nothing worse than than a beautiful contract that's absolutely never applied, and it actually triggers a litigation risk. And the second reason why it's actually not safe to just preserve the status quo in terms of templates, it's just because of what we mentioned in terms of European law increasingly imposing those higher standards in terms of clarity and accessibility of information. So if your templates do not fit those new standards, then you're actually creating risks, not changing them.
And it's kind of a nice way to that, because ultimately that's what the phrase legal design means, right? It's not just about design. You've got to get that robustness into your documents, into your processes, and you've got to deliver them ultimately for the end user. So we're just about out of time. Thank you to everyone for attending. As we mentioned, the webinar has been recorded and the link will be sent out shortly along with the slides, so you can take a look. You've got our contact details here, so it's richard@juro.com and maria.legal. And you've got our websites and the Juro Twitter handle there. Thank you for dialing in, and we'll be in touch when we have the next webinar ready. See you then.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Marie.
Thanks, everyone.